The United Nations had had an interest in national institutions for a long time. The earliest reference we find to them, in fact, was in the late 1940s, when at that stage the UN human rights system and the General Assembly were encouraging the development of human rights committees of one kind or another at the national level to promote and ensure education in the area of human rights. From that early beginning, there was increasing discussion over the decades of these independent national bodies that should be responsible for the domestic incorporation of international standards, monitoring their implementation and acting themselves to protect people from human rights violations. So they have a long history. The first time that they were brought together, that they met as national human rights institutions, was this meeting in Paris late in 1991. That meeting was convened by the UN at the specific decision of the then UN Commission on Human Rights. And it represented the first opportunity that these institutions had had to talk amongst themselves. Fortunately, at that meeting, it was suggested that it would be good to have international standards for national institutions. And in fact, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner of the day, Brian Burdekin, who was a participant in that meeting, proposed and took along some suggestions, an initial draft of what standards might look like. And they became very much the focus of discussion at that first meeting in Paris and culminated in a revised version of the draft being debated and negotiated and finally adopted by the institutions themselves. The Paris Principles then became something that is almost unique in the international system, in that they were not developed by governments or states or diplomats, but by the institutions themselves. They were subsequently endorsed by the UN Commission on Human Rights, and then in 1993, 20 years ago, by the UN General Assembly. But all the Commission did, and the General Assembly did, was to endorse the initiative taken by the institutions themselves. So these principles very much reflect what national institutions themselves had learned from their own experience, operating within their own countries during the years leading up to 1991, and then expressed in more legal form. And it's very fortunate for us that this was done then. We have seen literally an explosion in the numbers of national human rights institutions in the 22 years since they were first developed. Simply put, the Paris Principles are the international minimum standards for national human rights institutions, for institutions that are independent, credible and effective. Perhaps the most fundamental principle is independence. A national human rights institution is like a court, or should be like a court. It should be established under the constitutional governance framework of any state and ensure that it is fully independent in the way in which it goes about its responsibilities. There are many aspects of the Paris Principles when it deals with independence. They include legal independence, operational independence, policy independence, financial independence, the way in which institutions go about their task, the way in which they think and act at all times. There are some aspects of the Paris Principles that are very, very specific, and applying those parts is quite straightforward. In relation to the more general aspects, the International Coordinating Committee of National Human Rights Institutions, which is the international association of all of our bodies, has developed a series of general observations that provide greater detail, greater specificity in understanding what the Paris Principles actually require and how national human rights institutions individually should meet those standards.